Welcome to the Student Success Podcast. I'm Al Solano, founder of the Continuous Learning Institute, or CLI, a higher education online resource focused on providing community college and open access university educators with practical information on how to get results at their campus. As a resource within CLI, the Student Success Podcast is focused on just that: the challenges, opportunities, failures, and successes of practices intended to improve student success and equity. The goal is to leave you with thought-provoking ideas, nuts and bolts information, and or lessons learned from the field so you can consider how you might apply them to your institutional context. For today's podcast, it's a pleasure to have Dr. Dayamudra Dennehy, an ESL tenured faculty at City College of San Francisco. She's active in a network of California community college educators and serves as her college's distance education coordinator. Dayamudra founded an educational nonprofit organization, collaborating with an India-based team to launch an alternative leadership academy and educational residence, serving caste-oppressed students in South India who have dropped out of high school. Dayamudra was ordained as a Buddhist on a mountaintop in Spain and has taught meditation and yoga workshops around the world. She earned a doctorate in educational leadership with a focus on equity and social justice. Welcome to the Student Success Podcast, Dayamudra.
Thanks, Dr. Al. I'm so happy to be here.
Wonderful to have you. So I start all podcasts. I ask guests if they wouldn't mind sharing a hobby or a story with the audience, anything that you wouldn't mind sharing.
Yeah, well, my hobby, I would say, is dance. I've danced for a long, long time. And I was thinking today, as we were preparing for the interview, how dance is actually a language. It has vocabulary and grammar. And I'm really in love with any African-based dance. I've done a lot of West African and Afro-Cuban, Afro-Haitian, and all of the Latin dances have African roots as well. The African dances are a form of prayer, and they really respond to the seasons, and they're an interaction with the drum. And so, if you watch, especially like Cuban dance or something like that, when the drum beats change, the dance changes. And I've really loved sort of learning that vocabulary and just being in community with people. I take dance classes in the studio, but I also take dance classes online. So it's fun for me to also be an online learner.
I love that. Dance as a language. Let's unpack that a little bit, actually.
Yeah.
So what is your favorite language, so to speak, then?
Well, what's really interesting, I would say that my own dance foundation is really based in the West African tradition. And as you try the other, especially the Caribbean dances, you start to see these echoes. And especially there are certain rhythms where all of a sudden the movement becomes much more earthbound. And there are these samba forms from Brazil that only the elders do. And they're not the big showgirl samba rhythms. They're the much more small, intricate, earthbound movements. And that comes directly from Africa. And, there was a lot of information shared among enslaved people through the drum beats and the movements, and also celebration and flirtation, and just lots of, and prayer, right? The different African gods have different elements. My teacher, I take a great Latin grooves class on Saturday, and she was talking about one of the Afro gods that's about metal. And there's like certain movements that you do, and you do these dances before surgery because you want to please this god of metal. And I don't know, I was getting surgery a year ago, and it was just, it really touched me. I just felt there was something about moving my body in prayer to the metal, and somehow it gave me some courage.
That's beautiful, because you know that these movements, these dances have been passed through generations. They have roots. Who knows? They may be thousands of years old. We don't know. And we get that opportunity to learn these dances. So thank you for sharing that. That's beautiful. Now, I've done a podcast with Michelle Bakansky-Brock and with Maritis Apigo, and your name kind of keeps coming up. As someone who's admired for her teaching and learning, for her just how student-centered you are, how you think about equity in your teaching, and I really appreciate your social media posts I learn a lot from them. And so I wanted to start the podcast talking about AI, right? We have this proliferation of AI, specifically ChatGPT. And I've seen that you've been doing a little bit of homework, I should say a lot of homework about it, trying to learn about it. As you collected information about it, what are your learnings? Can you share what you're learning about that, especially as it relates to teaching and learning?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just really admire Michelle and Maritez, and I learned so much from them. They're really examples of online excellence. So I'm honored to be mentioned in their presence. And I think, your podcast, I was listening to it in preparation for our interview, and you talk about challenge, opportunities, failures, and successes, and sort of looking at AI through that lens. I mean, first of all, ChatGPT 3.0 was released at the end of November, and there was a lot of buzz around it, and I really didn't know what it was. So I just started doing a lot of research. And in my research, I've been in conversation with educators from around the world, like Mahabali in Egypt, and different educators in Australia and Canada and Europe, and just sort of hearing how people are thinking about using the tools and what's possible and what concerns people have, trying to sort of get my mind around what the tools are. The fact is students are already using them. So how are we going to keep up? And on the one hand, there's some excitement, and then there's also a lot of fear, like, is AI going to put us out of business? So these are sort of the working questions that I have, thinking about, what digital literacy is, not just for our students, but for ourselves, what academic integrity means. And more than that, sort of looking at our teaching through a Freirean lens, right? Paulo Freire, of seeing our students as coming with knowledge and contributing to the learning community, sort of decolonizing our pedagogy through the lens of Paulo Freire, as opposed to, the students listen to me and I tell them what to do and they take a test and they give me the answers. So all of that is sort of exciting to me. And I'm really in learner mode about it. But one thing I've been doing is just curating what I'm learning. I put together a ChatGPT guide for my college. And just at a meeting earlier today, one of my colleagues in the business department said, "Oh, it's been really helpful. And I've been sharing resources with my students, and they've been using ChatGPT to do different versions of their resume." So that makes me really happy to really be in this inquisitive state of mind around what these tools are and how we can use them.
You mentioned the word fear. There is actually a lot of fear. I know even some school districts are banning it.
Hmm.
That's not my approach. I've been saying with this AI, and boy, is it really taking off. There's AI now. You can create videos. You just pick your avatar. It's not a cartoon. It's a person. It's an avatar. You write in your text, and boom, you have you have a video. I've seen AI make ads.
Mm.
The world is going to be changing significantly, and I think some of the fear is understandable, right? AI could really be changing the way people work, or in some cases, it makes some roles obsolete.
Right.
As educators, in your view, how can we help students be prepared for this rapid changing world of AI? How would you help your students prepare?
I think we need to back it up even a little bit further and say, what about us? What do we know about these tools? What do we understand? Unfortunately, I'm on listservs where teachers are saying things like, my students were cheating. They copied stuff off of ChatGPT, and so I dropped them from the class. Ha ha ha. There's this, I don't know. For me, that's super interesting. Like, our pedagogy of how do we teach? How do we assess learning? How do we communicate with our students? I feel like that's an interesting aspect of all of this. And I think that the AI tools are shedding some light on that. I'm just very interested in, as a Buddhist, like, what is that feeling, right? So pause for a moment and think, like, your student used ChatGPT to do their homework. Like, why are you actually angry about it? Like, what is that? Like, it's a trained response, right? Like, oh, I'm so angry. And, even myself, it was funny because I shared this story with you, but the day that you asked me to be on the podcast, I was thinking, oh, ChatGPT, and yeah, I love all the AI tools. And then I opened up Canvas, and I had 3 homework submissions, and I was asking students to use the conditional to write a paragraph. It was a very low stakes formative assessment. And this paragraph that the first student submitted was completely copied off of ChatGPT. And I thought, oh, isn't that funny? I was laughing at myself because I thought, here I am with my authentic assessment and the student is cheating anyway. Really, the ask was to produce a piece of writing that was accurate. So she did do that. And then the second homework assignment that I opened, the student had been obviously really looking at the grammar and working with it. He had a few errors. And then the third student that submitted, it was full of errors and they clearly hadn't mastered the grammar at all. So it made me think, how are we assessing students? Who gets the points? And what are we rewarding students for? Are we rewarding them for accuracy, creating a final product, or are we rewarding them for the learning process? And so I just, it really kind of opened up some reflective questions for me. And I shared that with my students. And the first student, I just said, I know that I actually put it through Turnitin and it was 100% plagiarized. And I didn't have to do that. Like, I know her writing. I know that that wasn't her writing. And what I said, like, rather than being angry about it, and not that there's anything wrong with anger, but just keeping that relationship, just saying, I really want to give you some input and some feedback on your writing, and you're going to lose that opportunity. So I want to see what you write so that we can be in conversation about your process. And she really heard that. She didn't feel shamed. I didn't have to shame her. And then she submitted something that was really bad. So I was able to give her a lot of feedback. But, I think that we really have to think about, what is the relationship with our students? Do we trust them? What do we do? And not like cheating is something new, right? I was thinking how old cheating is and all the ways that we used to cheat in our face-to-face classrooms. I think we all have experiences of, if we didn't cheat, when I was taking French class, I let all my friends cheat off of me. We had this very elaborate system. And I didn't feel bad at all because I thought the tests were really stupid. So, what's the value that we bring and what's the process, and how do we design our assessments so that they're meaningful for students?
So the response, this is interesting, right? Because you work hard to develop relationships with your students. Your approach wasn't to get angry right away. You approached it really with kindness.
Mm.
You approached it with, hey, let's have a conversation
Right.
about this. And I think that we don't have enough of that, actually.
Right.
And it could be that because you're the learner too in the classroom, we often forget that teachers should be, right, the constant learners, continually improving their craft, that you're going to eventually find ways where you can incorporate ChatGPT in some way, more intentional, as maybe as a way for students to use critical thinking skills to modify whatever because ChatGPT is not perfect, right?
No.
So because you have that creativity, you have a different mindset, a different approach to students, I think you are going to be able to have an easier time incorporating this technology in teaching and learning. You said something too about designing assignments and really checking for student learning. Can you explain more of what you've done to assess student learning? Because there's been, and I love it, there's been this movement of ungrading. I think it should be called a different name because it's kind of now it's just highly charged, but I think it's great. It's beautiful because it focuses actually on the learning and not so much on points, right? So can you explain more how you do that in the classroom?
This is really the heart of it. Like, how do we assess students? So if we want students to just spit back the information that we gave them, if we see the student as an empty glass, to use the Paulo Freire pedagogy again, and we're just filling them up with water, then, that's not really critical thinking. But if, we want the students to be able to connect what we're learning in class with their own experiences. So the more opportunities they get to do that, the more meaningful the learning will be, and the harder it is going to be to use these tools. So that's one way. I have students create digital portfolios rather than a final paper so that throughout the class they're documenting what they're learning. And I do a lot of reflection. I think for a lot of students it's overkill, but I really want them to really be reflecting on their learning, building those metacognition skills. Yeah, a lot of formative assessments, just connecting things, maybe giving different sources that they're reading or watching or listening to, and then making connections between those different artifacts and their own experience. And this is, I think, the bigger conversation that's happening. I mean, the fact is, we're not going to be able to catch all the AI generated work. It's just getting better and better. And the tools, the surveillance tools that we're using, first of all, I think we should really question some of these surveillance tools and the ethics of those, but they're not always accurate. They create false negatives and false positives rather than having this cat and mouse game and being so committed to catching students cheating, using that deficit thinking about how are we really designing our learning and our assessment, and really building relationships with students, seeing students as equals rather than inferiors.
Yes, and these surveillance tools, boy, they really stress some students out. I've seen it where they're taking a test and they happen to look another way because they have to move their head or so, and then now they're cheating. It's just and some students who already have a lot of anxiety, they might not be in a safe space, and it doesn't make for a positive learning experience.
Yeah, and it comes back to trust. Like, do we trust our students? Or do we have this sort of colonialist model where we inherently distrust them, or we're suspicious of them, or we're trying to control them? I think that the pandemic opened a lot of opportunities, but it also exposed a lot of that. I mean, I just started a 6-week class, and I always start with my camera policy, and I have a discussion like, what do you think? What's comfortable for you? And so I'll just put up a slide of, here's some reasons students keep their cameras off. Here's some reasons why teachers like cameras on. What do you think? And it was a very rich conversation. One student's like, I'm eating dinner. I don't want to be on camera. And another student said, well, I really miss seeing my classmates. I don't want to be the only one on camera. And then I was able to say, it's really sad for me just to look at a screen full of black boxes. So we were able to come up with a conversation about it. And ultimately I said, I trust you. And this one student was like, wow, my teacher last semester said, I need everybody to have cameras on because I don't know what you're doing. And I was like, wow, let's just pause on that for a minute. I don't know what you're doing either. And I don't need to know. But it's not about that, like, let's learn together. And I'm going to trust that you're there. You're an adult. You've got a busy life. You're taking this class. You make your own choices, but I'm not really interested in policing my students.
I'm reflecting on trust here as you're talking about trust. And I can hear some people say, well, you still can't trust all of them, and cheating is just, that's unacceptable. I'm thinking now about trust for a moment. Maybe it's because to students throughout their experience in K-12 and on to higher ed, because there was such a deficit mindset toward them, this mistrust, they begin to behave as such.
Right. Yeah, you train that. I mean, I do think there's something about academic integrity. So it's not to say that it's wrong to tell students to create their own work. Of course, we want them to create their own work, but I feel like that could be a more transparent conversation rather than just don't trust, don't cheat because I tell you not to cheat, but really kind of digging into it a little bit and looking at the tools. What are the tools helpful for? And also, what do we consider cheating? I mean, it's very interesting, even the way that we assess students, it's very individual, it's timed. And if we're training them for the real world, the outcomes that they create at their jobs are going to be much more fluid than that. They're going to involve collaboration. They're going to be done in iterations. They're going to be done over time. And so how are we training students for real world outcomes, which will include AI tools? So if we ban students from using AI tools, we're not actually preparing them for the jobs. And maybe we're not incorporating the AI tools because we don't understand them. So we need to build our own digital literacy. But I think we're going to have to start incorporating the tools just so that the students are ready when they leave our institutions for what they're expected to do in the world. Because if we don't, then that's an inequity. Then they're not really trained for the things they're going to need to do.
I love your approach in that you're co-learning with your students.
Mhm. Yeah.
I love because even that example of the video, right? It wasn't just a policy or here I'm laying down the law. You actually had a conversation where they understood your point of view of why, look, I don't want to see a bunch of videos turned off, black screens, right? And you just being honest about that, I think it allowed them to understand your point of view. And at the same time, you're letting them know, okay, and if you keep it, I trust that you are paying attention, you have your reasons for having it turned off. So it's these conversations that we don't seem to be having with students.
But I also think that the students aren't really included in these conversations either. Like everything I'm following on Twitter are classroom teachers and tech people, but you really don't hear student voices about AI. So I would love to see more panels that actually include students and their perspectives, because I really feel like that's missing from these conversations as well.
I generate a lot of original content, and I have recently been using ChatGPT, and I just find that it saves me a little bit of time, but also I can analyze what it gave me. Give me an example. I was in a meeting the other day, and we need to come up with a survey for faculty on their culturally responsive practices. Because one of the things that I've been talking about, I've been wanting for years, is we keep talking about culture, be culturally responsive, be culturally responsive, and that's great. A lot of it is about having a mindset, but I like to see more content examples of it.
Yeah.
And so we're creating a survey with a team so that we can survey faculty and ask them specific questions. How are you specifically culturally responsive? And I just, we were struggling. We're creating it together. I was like, wait a second. Let me just go to Chat GPT for a moment.
Yeah.
And I said, please generate. Well, maybe I did not say please. So I said, generate a 10-question survey on faculty culture responsive practice. And it wasn't bad. I had to tweak it.
Yeah.
But even I'm learning, right, that this is a tool that if we have this co-learning, this conversation with students in the same way I was having this conversation with faculty that I work with as we were using this tool together,
Mm.
it just made for a really good product, and we all learned from it, right? The other thing that you said that struck me was about deadlines and the real world, because you're a community college instructor. I've said this so many times that I really adore, value these precious institutions because we open our doors to the most disproportionately impacted, right?
Yeah.
We're not the Ivy Leagues or some big name schools that get to choose their students, right? We get to teach those who are, former foster youth, veterans, formerly incarcerated, or students of color, et cetera. And it's not a burden to teach them; it's an absolute privilege.
Yeah.
And many of them, they have families, they're single parents, or they have families, they have a lot of commitments, they're working 2, 3 different jobs. And this issue of deadlines has been really interesting to me because some faculty, not all, say, well, if I don't keep the deadline, then how are they going to learn to do that in the real world? And I'm like, wait a second. There's deadlines extensions in the real world all the time.
Yeah.
And B, many of these students are reentry and they have been living in the real world and all they're looking to learn.
Right. I know it's so condescending to say that we're preparing them for the real world. They have so much more real knowledge than we do, I would say. And I mean, I think the real world is about negotiating and having agency and having autonomy. And so, yeah, I mean, when my students come to me and say, oh, I've had a really hard week and this happened and that happened, can I have an extra week? The first thing I always say is, I'm so proud of you for advocating for yourself. And of course, I mean, it's different, right? Like, you need a week, no problem. The student who comes to you at the end of the semester, like, can I hand in the 25 assignments that I didn't do? Like, that's a different situation. And to be honest, in my 20 plus years of teaching, there's no way to sort of plan for that because those students are going to do that no matter what your policy is. But I have deadlines. My things are due every week with the understanding that life happens. And, again, like, do we mistrust our students? If someone says to me, my grandmother died, I don't need the death certificate. If you say you're in the hospital, I don't need the doctor's note. Like, I trust you. And if maybe you just had a bad week and I don't know. To me, why can't we be flexible? I don't understand that. In my field in ESL, the work builds. So if you don't do week 1, then it's kind of hard to go on to week 2. So, but again, it's being explaining that it's not that you're bad and I need to shame you, but this is the way the learning process is. And if you need more time, let's negotiate it. Let's have a communication. This is a communication class, so let's communicate about it. But honestly, so many students are so fearful to even ask because they've been so shamed. And I don't know, like, why do we have to talk to students like that?
One of the things that I have noticed, because I do a lot of work with colleges to improve so many practices, basically it's culture changing work. And one of the things that I always tell them is be mindful of when you do the following. So for example, you're in a committee meeting and one faculty member says something, says, yeah, I don't want to do that. And then everybody leaves the meeting going, well, faculty don't want to do that.
Mm.
It was that one person who doesn't necessarily represent everybody, right? And the same thing with administrators, right? A dean may say something in a meeting, yeah, we don't want to do that. I don't think we should do that. And then everybody leaves the meeting. See, administration doesn't want to do that.
Right.
That was one dean. And I think
Mm.
this happens with students where some faculty, not all, will say, well, with AI, well, students are going to cheat or students cheat or we can't give them deadlines because then what students do is that they take advantage. And then you ask them, how many students are actually taking advantage?
Yeah.
And it's never the majority. It's only like far and few between, right? Has that been your experience too?
Yeah. And what does it mean to take advantage? Like, what are they doing? Like, I just, that language, again, it's deficit language. I mean, of course, you're going to have a student who doesn't do their work and has tons of excuses. You can't design for that. I don't know. I don't know what to do with that student. They need some time management skills, or maybe they've just got too much going on in their life. I don't know. But I mean, I give my students very clear deadlines. And I feel like that structure is really important. I don't know. I've never had students who are like, "Well, I'm just going to hand in the work whenever." Like, they want the structure. They want to do the work. That's why they're taking the class. So, I don't know. I do hear that a lot. Well, the students are going to take advantage, and I just don't understand this kind of military language. You had mentioned Marites, and she mentioned a colleague of our, Fabiola, who teaches these equity courses for At One. And one of the things she had us do was look at our syllabus language. It was really fascinating because I had written my first syllabus when I was just out of teacher school, like in my 20s, and I was like a young girl and I really wanted to be taken seriously. So my language was very militaristic, like you will learn, you don't learn. And it was all about, you will be dropped from the class and you'll receive a 0. And it was so punishing. And I just kind of adapted it every year. I had never gone back to look at it. And in Faviola's class, I went in with an equity lens and I thought, that's interesting. Why am I speaking like that? Like, why am I instilling this fear in students in the first week? And does it work? And so I just took this, and we all sort of learned from Michelle Pacansky-Brock. So I really changed my syllabus language to welcome, and I'm so happy you're here. And gosh, what do they say? You get more flies with honey than vinegar. Like, it just setting up that welcoming, warm, humanizing tone motivates students to do their best. Like, I've seen such a change when I made that change, when I decided, I'm here for you. I want you to be successful. And, of course, there are students that are going to take advantage or whatever, but overall, I do wonder, like, who taught us to come in and be like, I'm not going to take any crap from my students. Like, why do we do that? It just kills the love and the joy. And since I've taken a more humanizing approach, I think I've been able to become more vulnerable, and my students like me and respect me more, and they're more engaged because I'm a real person. I'm not trying to be some kind of dictator in the class.
I think the best PD is that teacher down the hall from you.
Mm. Right.
I think that's the best PD when you can learn from someone like you who is continually improving their craft. I think the challenge in higher ed, though, is that it's such a teaching in higher ed could be such a lonely profession.
Right.
And depending on the campus, I just met with several today, actually. It was really interesting. So, one campus has zero flex days,
Mm.
no college hour, nothing. And basically, it's just faculty go do your thing. You can go to a conference, but there isn't much genuine, deep collaboration because department meetings are mostly about like kind of logistical stuff, right? It's not always about teaching and learning. And I just wish there was a space at each campus where a setting where faculty can come together
Yeah.
and a community of practice, if you will, to formalize something. There are things like that that happen informally, but just to formalize something like that to because imagine like you, Fabiola, and Marites, right, Michelle, and if you had communities of practice within your campuses to just continually learn
Yeah.
from one another, right? And especially how do we onboard new faculty who come in with these, and I don't want to have a deficit mindset toward them. They just were taught these antiquated practices, right?
And as adjuncts, when I was an adjunct, I was teaching Sunday mornings in Chinatown and evenings out of Visitation Valley. And, I didn't see anybody. I was coming and going, taking the classes nobody else wanted. I had a class once at 7 a.m., another class at 6 p.m., so I wasn't connected with the rest of the faculty at all. So there was no way for me to learn from the veteran teachers who had maybe developed more sophisticated practices. And I had to really seek that out. I mean, I will say for me, Twitter is a really great professional learning network. I just learn so much from people there, and especially community college educators from across the state of California. So I have really sought out those people. And a lot of us are sort of armies of one on our campus, with one idea that hasn't quite caught on yet. Even online learning was a real, something I got a lot of pushback on a couple of years before the pandemic. So to have that support through social networks, I'm really grateful for that. That's really something new and very, you need that. It's very nourishing.
I center a lot of my work on kindness. So what I appreciate about our conversation is that I just see you as someone who really cares about students and you want to have conversations with them. You want them to be involved in the learning, to have even some decision making in the learning. And that's just it's really flipping things. And from what we learn I think maybe let's try to solve this problem here. Solve the world's problems, then after this we'll solve the Middle East, right? So I just think that first of all, our graduate schools can do a much better job. I really do feel like they don't adequately prepare those who are going, who earn PhDs in specific subject areas. They are subject matter experts, and that's beautiful. That's wonderful. But there's hardly anything around pedagogy, assessing learning, et cetera. So they learn a lot of those antiquated practices
Mm-hmm.
there in graduate school. In fact, a few weeks ago, I was so elated. I'll be honest, I almost wanted to cry because I do work with campuses where we are able to have a setting and we work in teams with faculty. And this one faculty member had shared, he is a self-described kind of hard ass. And as part of this team, they said, we're going to change 2 or 3 things about our practices. Nothing huge.
Mm.
He decided that he was going to be more flexible with his deadlines. He decided he's going to be more welcoming, especially that 0 to 2 week, and that he never did a drop of any exam, never. And he decided that he would allow students to drop the lowest, right?
Mm.
And then he showed his fall 21 and fall 22 comparison data, course success data. That vulnerability to share your data with your colleagues was so touching. And then to see the improvements with DI populations.
Mm.
It was a significant improvement. For whatever reason, we would have to study this more, but the Latino population had a nice jump in course success rate. So sometimes, I mean, right, all we have to do is just change one or two things. We don't have to overhaul right away, right? And then we learn from that. Next semester, let's build on that. That's, I think, an approach, because sometimes faculty feel like there's a lot of pressure to change and they think that they have to do it wholesale, but sometimes just do one or two things and do them well. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, and I think just coming back to the AI question, what is the value that we bring? And I think, what can AI not do? And it's what we do as human beings. Students can learn English on YouTube. They don't have to come to my class. Why do they come to my class? They come because I'm guiding them and mentoring them. They know I care about them. They get to meet other people that are studying together. We create a learning community. That's the value that we bring. And then we have the scale of economy in libraries and our campuses. We have this identity of being learners together. So that's something that AI is never going to be able to offer. So I think that's something that we can relax into. And as we examine our pedagogy and our assessment methods, really thinking about those things and how, what is the value that we bring and how can we bring more value by maybe redesigning the way we use the tools, the way we teach students about the tools, the policies that we create. Because I think it's really about communication and relationships. And that's the human aspect of what we do. And we want teachers. I want teachers. I could just watch videos, but I get up at the crack of dawn to take a class with a teacher in Japan, like, because I love her class. It's a dance class. It's this woman named Moga. You might have seen, she had a viral video. She has her own kind of funky hip hop. There was a video of her that went viral on TikTok, and I contacted her, and so she just sets up her camera, her phone actually, in the back of her dance studio, and it's all these Japanese people from the town, and then me she does an Instagram live, and I'm in this dance class with her and all these Japanese students. She doesn't speak a word of English, and super fun.
One of the things, I immersed myself many years ago in the Japanese culture. One of the things I appreciated about their, especially the way they approach teaching and learning, is that they go so far as to watch each other teach.
Ah.
And they give each other feedback. And it's so hard to do that in this culture in the United States, because it becomes like, oh, you're pointing fingers at me.
Right.
And that's not how the Japanese see it. Japanese educators see it as, we're focusing on the practice.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're trying to continually improve, is that practice. And so they're not pointing fingers. They have this, just, it's embedded in their culture of continuous improvement. And so I've always appreciated that about their educational culture. It's very difficult to have these settings in higher ed, especially like you mentioned your story as an adjunct, right? What would you say, as we wrap up here, to, let's say, someone brand new comes into your college and they approach you and they say, I fresh out of graduate school, I got my PhD in whatever, chemistry or English. I'm hungry to do well. They really, truly care about teaching.
Mm-hmm.
What are some things that right off the bat you would tell them they can work on to right away to improve their craft, to make sure that they have the highest success rates as possible, right? Because we've had faculty, unfortunately, that were taught that our job is to weed out, right? Our job is to make sure that we have this kind of toxic rigor language, right? That we got to weed them out, right? So what advice would you give that faculty member who's hungry to do well?
I keep coming back to communication and relationships. So I think having other people that you can be really vulnerable with. I have a good friend. We're on the phone every day together, and we talk about our successes and also our struggles. I don't have to sort of pretend with her. And so I think having people you can kind of, because there are some things that are going to be very hard to teach. What do you do when you're presenting content and students just don't get it? You're trying to get into that zone of proximal development. It's too easy. It's too hard. I remember that it was after 10 years of teaching that I thought, oh, okay, I'm hitting my stride now. Like but it really took 10 years to feel like I knew what I was doing. Before that, I was really kind of terrified every time I went into the classroom. So I think in some ways too, just being super organized, being very clear. Some things that I find really helpful, whether I do this on Zoom or in class, I just put up an agenda. This is what we're going to do today. So students have a roadmap. They're clear. I'm very clear about what the assignments are, why they're doing that, when it's due. So just trying to be very transparent and then finding ways to support students because like students don't come to office hours. So how do you give them that support before it's too late? How can you encourage students to find study groups? I mean, a lot of students already do that. They have these back channels where they study together. But I think, what is a way that you can build the learning community and really be responsive to your students, get feedback from them? Sometimes I'll just pause and say, how are we doing? Does this make sense? Are you confused? Do you get it? Do you want more practice? And I feel like students really appreciate that because then I know, oh, we're going to need to spend another week on this. I know when I started teaching, I was really trying so hard to get through as much content as possible. And when I hit my stride at the 10-year mark, I realized that I was relaxed and I knew what I was going to teach, but I wasn't rushing through it. I was responsive to the students, not to the content. So I was teaching them, they came to learn content, but I was teaching the people in front of me. I wasn't just teaching the material, on my slides or in my lesson plans. So I think all of that is sort of a learning process. It's a discovery and it's very experiential.
I have one last question. It goes back to your hobby.
Mm.
How would you, let's say you were doing a webinar, you're at a conference and you were asked to use dance. It's a language, right? You also have experience teaching it, being taught.
Mm-hmm.
How would you use dance as a metaphor for teaching and learning?
I do use dance in my classroom. Like I literally use it. So I get students up and dancing. I was just meeting with a friend over the weekend and she said, I remember the first time I met you at a Katisol conference, you had us up all doing Bhangra. So I do bring dance into my presentations, into my lessons, because it gets people laughing and relaxed. So there's that flow of sort of doing things together and doing it to a rhythm. So I think, literally using dance, but also just being, when you're dancing with music, listening to the music, it's very interesting if you watch, especially Afro-Cuban, you can really see the dancers are responding to the drums, but the drummers are responding to the dancers. And then the crowd is feeding that energy. And, children will just sort of jump in and they let the kids dance. And so it's this, I think there's like a joy. And I always do tell my students too that they say that there are two things that you should do for your brain health. And one is learn a new language, and the other is dance, because you're making these patterns that keep your brain healthy. So I think if you do both of those things, you'll have a healthy brain and a happy life.
That's beautiful. So I want to thank you for your kindness towards students and kindness towards your colleagues. And thank you for participating in the Student Success Podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to talk to you, and I really appreciate all that you give to all of us through your work. It's so valuable.
Thank you for listening to the Student Success Podcast. Each episode has show notes, which include helpful links and necessary follow-up information to help you get results. Please consider subscribing to the Continuous Learning Institute website. There are no advertisements. It's simply updates about articles, tools, resources, podcasts, etc., all tailored for you, the practitioner. Thank you.